Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to today's session of our course, The History of English Language and Literature. Today we continue to locate the influence of Romanticism and also the age of Wordsworth, which was dominated by Romantic poetry. We have begun looking at the major figures and the major influences of this period. We are already in the middle of a discussion, and we've taken a look at how lyrical ballads played a major role in serving as a manifesto of the new kind of poetry, and also at how the life and works of Wordsworth was quite influential and fundamental in laying the foundations of this new era and this new literary genre. As an aside, we also need to take a look at how the term romantic came into being. It was first used by the German critics at the end of the 18th century. They used this term to describe certain particular and peculiar features that they found in their own poetry, in German poetry at the end of the 18th century. However, this term was later adapted by the British writers and the British historians as well, because they found that a similar kind of poetry was getting generated within Britain from the end of the 18th century onwards. So, we also find accordingly a very strong and pervasive influence of German Romantic poets and philosophers such as Schelling, the Schillers, as well as the most well-known poet of the Germans, Goethe. However, though this term began to be used from the late 18th century onwards, it did not gain much currency within the English-speaking land until the second half of the 19th century. And also interestingly, it was only at a later point of time, from the beginning of 20th century onwards, that a more sustained and more focused academic interest was getting generated into this form of Romantic poetry. However, interestingly, it was only from the later 19th century and from the early 20th century onwards, a sustained and focused academic interest on Romantic poetry in general was to begin. Having already taken a look at how Wordsworth had influenced the age of Romanticism, it's very important to now move on to the second most important figure, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who lived from 1772 to 1834. He was a most well-known contemporary of Wordsworth and also a very close friend of Wordsworth. And we also noted in the earlier session itself that together they had published Lyrical Ballads, the epoch-making book which was to become almost like a manifesto for this new poetry. Just like Wordsworth, Coleridge was also immensely influenced by the French Revolution. It instantly appealed to him. He was still a young boy when the fall of Bastille happened in 1789. But however, we find that his enthusiasm was quite sustained, and he did carry all of these romantic and radical ideals even when he went to Cambridge to continue his higher education. But however, the meeting with Robert Southey in 1794, it was to change his life and his worldview entirely, and Robert Southey incidentally was also to become his brother-in-law at a later point. And together, Coleridge and Southey, they even wanted to form a utopian kind of society where an ideal form of government and an ideal form of system of governance existed. Accordingly, we find them talking and even visualizing and kind of trying to conceptualize the particular society based on the ideals of pantisocracy. And this was also a product, a very direct product of the revolutionary zeal that both of them shared, and also a very direct influence of the French Revolution could be seen over here. But however, this being a very utopian kind of an ideal, we do not find this plan taking off in any way, and we do not find any good coming out of it either. But however, all of this was to get reflected later on in his poetic renditions. In 1796, he published his first set of poems titled as Religious Musings, The Destiny of Nations, and Ode to the Departing Year. And we do find that conceived in 1796 and later published in 1798, this work was hugely influential also in shaping Coleridge's own poetic career, because it's in this work that we find the supreme expressions of his political aspirations. And Coleridge himself, he in fact talked about this particular work as his own recantation. So this work was influential also in identifying Coleridge as one of the poets who shared this revolutionary zeal along with many other contemporaries. Like Wordsworth, we find Coleridge also going through most of the stages of a reaction to French Revolution, and finally we find him aligning himself with a conservative cause, just like Wordsworth. And however, his life in general, it was not very focused. We do not find him focusing entirely on poetry like Wordsworth did. In fact, many historians later feel that his work, his life in general was quite aimless, and because of this, there were a lot of aimless wanderings and travels that he undertook, which were not really productive in the conventional sense of the term. And he also used to make a lot of plans and then later abandon them because he could not really focus on anything in particular to bring it to realization. His life in general was characterized by a lot of failures, one after the other, and a bitter sense of failure continued to haunt him and also his works in the coming years. And he was absolutely wanting in willpower. And in spite of the many interesting works and the many influential works that he published, and also his collaborative work with Wordsworth, bringing him a lot of recognition, in spite of all of these things, he really failed to make a mark during his own lifetime. It's also said that he was a slave to opium, and the drug had also further paralyzed his creative energies. Hudson makes this interesting remark about Coleridge. This divinely gifted Coleridge shambled through life, dreaming great dreams and projecting great books, but the dreams were never realized and the books were never written. But nevertheless, in spite of the very small amount of poetry that Coleridge produced, it's said that little is of rare excellence. That was a kind of genius that this man possessed, and needless to say, it was perhaps this visionary element in him that also prompted him to collaborate with Wordsworth and produce the most important and the epoch-making book of the century, Lyrical Ballads. His creative genius and his romantic and naturalist tendencies could be found in the few works that he had produced, the most important ones being Dejection and Ode, which is also known as a personal poem of Coleridge. Work Without Hope was structured in the form of a sonnet, and in both of these works, we do find a sense of his own life dominating his poetic expression. It's in that sense a little dark and gloomy. It also talks about many failures human beings in general are forced to encounter. In his two very important works, The Ancient Mariner and Christabel, we find him celebrating the triumph of Romanticism, and in Kubla Khan also we find the same romantic strain dominating, and also it's in this work that one of the earliest works which has the East as a theme begins to manifest itself. And talking about all these three works, The Ancient Mariner, Christabel and Kubla Khan, it is said that it could be seen as a poetic equivalent of the Gothic novel, because in all of these works, the supernatural begins to dominate it in a very interesting way. So in that sense, we find a very different kind of romantic poetry getting produced by Coleridge, starkly different from that of Wordsworth, who turned to his immediate surroundings and the immediate natural elements to produce and to inspire his poetry. And together we do find that they made it possible for all kinds of new imaginative tendencies to be included into this new romantic poetry which had come into being. To quote Coleridge's own lines from his poetry, "I may not hope from outward forms to win the passion and the life whose fountains are within." Just like in these lines, he continued to celebrate and talk about the power of human imagination to remold nature itself. So we continue to emphasize this fact that throughout the Romantic age, we find the single word imagination dominating all the creative elements, and also the reception of the poetry is also quite significant in the sense that the people in general, they also began to celebrate the significance of this one element, imagination, in their own lives as well. Attempting a comparison between Wordsworth and Coleridge, Hudson makes this remark: "Wordsworth saved naturalism from the hard literalism to which it was tending by touching fact with imagination. Coleridge saved supernaturalism from the coarse sensationalism then in vogue by linking it with psychological truth." So we find that taking two different trajectories of poetic renditions, both of them had become the foundational elements in situating what was later to be celebrated as the Romantic poetry of the 19th century. As we noted right in the beginning in the previous session, it's very important to take a look at some of the writers who paved the way towards this romantic revival. We had taken a look at a number of works and a number of writers who had begun to talk about the romantic elements, even though they were situated chronologically within the age of Johnson and as an extension of the Augustan tradition. So, as noted before, romantic strains were visible in the poetry of primarily of William Cowper, Robert Burns and William Blake. The life and works of Cowper and Burns we've already taken a look at, and we need to today focus our attention on William Blake, who also anticipated the Lake School of Poetry. Interestingly, most of these writers of the Romantic age, they were all born in the Lake District, and hence this term, the Lake School of Poetry, which got associated with them at the later point. Chronologically, William Blake lived in the pre-Romantic period, but however he is known as the forerunner of the Romantic period, and he is also considered as more romantic than the Romantic writers themselves. He lived from 1757 till 1827, and his reputation as a painter and engraver further enhanced his reputation of seeing visions right from his childhood. In fact, it's said that many of these visions that he claimed to have been seeing from his childhood onwards, they all significantly influenced the production of his poetry, and also the quality of the kind of illustrations that he used to come up with from the late 18th century onwards. Though he was of not a very aristocratic or very learned kind of origins, he was quite widely read. He was familiar with the works of Dante, Shakespeare and Milton. They all had a significant and a massive influence in Blake's life and works. Blake had a very different kind of influence shaping his poetical works. He was influenced by religion, the spiritual world, and also the presence of the divine in man. And talking about his career and about his expertise, he was triumphant in two different kinds of arts, in poetry and in engraving. So in that sense, he gave a very different shade to the idea of romanticism altogether. In 1789, his Songs of Innocence was published. It was also incidentally the year which inaugurated the French Revolution. And this work, the Songs of Innocence, was illustrated and printed by himself, which also added more interest and more rarity to this particular work. And in the Songs of Innocence, we find an extension of Milton in the works of Blake. This was an evocation of that paradise which Milton had declared lost. So in that sense, it's a work of redemption as well. However, it was different in yet another way as well. Blake locates innocence not in the race as in the mankind in general, not in the race childhood, but in the individual's childhood. And this was more significant because in the Romantic age, from the late 18th century onwards, there is a renewed emphasis on the idea, on the quality of the individual, and also on a more sense of accountability and responsibility also coming in, because it was also the age of liberalism, democracy and rationality. And in that sense, because of this ways in which he takes off from Milton and also later departs from the poetical traditions of Milton, he's also considered as one of the greatest poets after Milton. In 1794, he produced the Songs of Experience. In this one, we find him talking about the child experiences and the experiences of a young adult. And we also find that they are no longer innocent, but they are impeded by social and religious oppression. We also find a certain biographical element coming into it, because we do find a lot of illustrations of death, weeping, menace and desolation, which was also characteristics of the age in which Blake was living. We also find him not romanticizing life in general, but talking about the real problems and also finding about a way in which they could be manifested in poetry in a very different way. And in terms of technique also, his work was supreme and it was quite distinct from the other works of the period. He printed his own works through a method that he had devised by himself. It was known as relief etching, because in his works, it was not just about text, it was not just about writing, it was a rich marriage of text and illustration. And the kind of influences and the kind of sources which from which he drew, that were also quite varied in nature. In fact, we find him appropriating from the mythical works. We find him reworking certain mythical elements and building them into his own works. He had drawn in immense inspiration from the traditions and symbols from Swedenborgian mysticism and from Christianity and also from Renaissance art. So in that sense, we also find a continuance of tradition in Blake's works, and he just does not break away from whatever was existing in the past, but in a way he kind of assimilates all that is useful for him, useful in the sense all that could be transformed into a new kind of poetry, and he uses all of them not just in his writing but also in the illustrations and in the paintings and the engravings that he produced. He was also immensely influenced by not just English poetry but by European poetry in general, and he was also majorly interested in religious poetry, which also dominated the theme and also the subject matter and treatment of his own works. So these are the ways in which he tried to illustrate his own works. In fact, it was quite interesting that this was something the 18th century and the 19th century audience were not used to, and interestingly they continue to fascinate the readers because of its amazing kind of illustrative abilities. Tiger, which begins with Tiger, Tiger burning bright, is one of the most famous poems of Blake. It continues to be widely read and even taught from the school curriculum onwards. But however, in spite of this wide influence that Blake had on the later Romantics and also on the formation of poetry and literature in 19th century in general, he remained largely unrecognized during his period, because he was mostly considered mad for his idiosyncratic ways, the ways in which he broke away from the conventions and the traditional kinds of artistic expressions. And also it was considered more esoteric because themes were expressed in difficult symbolic modes. It also took a more learned kind of mind with a more artistic bent to appreciate the kind of work that Blake was doing and also the kind of things that he was producing. However, at a later point, we do find that many 19th century scholars and many 19th century historians are more interested than ever in the works and the illustrations produced by Blake, and also a number of studies have been produced of late to talk about the kind of influence that Blake had as a founding and a foundational figure of 19th century Romanticism. Though the Romantic period was dominated by poets such as Wordsworth and Coleridge, followed by certain other poets as well, this was also the time of a lot of minor poets who were not really well known during their time, nor were they given due attention in the later period of time. But however, these contemporaries are worth taking a look at. And when we talk about contemporaries of the Romantic poets, we talk about the ones who were mostly born before 1780. They belong to different schools of writing and differently influenced in varied ways. And there are not many ways in which they could be clubbed together, hence this commonality of having born before 1780. We've arranged these set of contemporaries in a chronological order. William Bowles, his sonnets, a collection known as the Sonnets, is the most important and the most recognized work by him. This work had helped the growth of a love of nature in the years immediately preceding the lyrical ballad. So we find this working in two different ways. One, William Bowles was significantly influenced by the publication of the lyrical ballads, and secondly, Bowles' sonnet in many ways reiterated the effect and the influence of lyrical ballads. So the many contemporary poets and many readers found this extremely handy, because there was a way in which certain works were continuing the manifesto which was pronounced in lyrical ballads. And Coleridge, in fact, had testified to the great influence that this set of sonnets had on his life, and also we find that these works were much admired by Wordsworth. And when we talk about Samuel Rogers, he had a very distinctive ability built into him. He was a successful banker and a poet. It was a rare combination even then. He, however, was quite untouched by the revolution. This was very significant to be noted, because most of the writers and thinkers who lived during that period, they all were majorly influenced by the French Revolution. Their own life and career were shaped by the ways in which the French Revolution was progressing and the turning points that it was taking. So talking about Rogers, one of the historians remarked that he belongs to the past but did not possess the strength of genius to initiate a reaction. This is because his influence was mostly from the classical elements, and we also find him continuing in certain ways the Augustan tradition of the early 18th century. But however, as the historians have noted, his work did not have that kind of energy to move against the dominating grain of Romanticism. His two major important works were Pleasures of Memory and Italy, published in 1792 and 1822. Robert Southey deserves a more closer examination. He also, as we noted earlier, he was the poet laureate until Wordsworth took over after his death. And he was also one of the many poets who fell under the spell of the revolution and the immediate poetic reaction to this was the work known as an epic, Joan of Arc. It was written in 1793 but was published only in 1796. This work, it said that it gave vent to the most violent radical ideas and to his impatience of all the evils which were dominating the various kinds of society during that period. And we also find him reacting in multiple ways to the ideals of the revolution, and also showing signs of disappointment when the reign of terror had begun to dominate. The other important work of him, also considered as an epic, was Wat Tyler, published in 1794. And we also find that the overthrow of the Grandist party in the French Revolution, that it became a turning point in his own political reactions and political beliefs system as well. So after that, we also find him, like Wordsworth and Coleridge, turning away from these ideals of revolution. It said that he repudiated all his early ideas and became a Tory of the Tories. So we do notice that during this period, it was almost impossible to not be influenced by the ideals of a French Revolution, but at the same time, we do find a writer or two as an exception as well. The other important poems by Sade include After Blenheim, The Holly Tree and The Scholar. And A Vision of Judgment, in fact, it was a very different kind of work that Sade had written. It was a ludicrous eulogy of King George III. And this work is most remembered now only because Byron had scathingly attacked this work through one of his satires at a later point. Sade also wrote narrative poems such as Madoc, Thalaba the Destroyer, Roderick and the Curse of Kehama. He had in fact fashioned all of these works into an epic, but however later they did not reach the canvas which was fit enough for an epic, so they generally considered as narrative poems. It was greatly admired by Scott, Landor and Shelley, and it also was significant and representative of the age in which he lived. Walter Savage Landor, he published his first volume of poetry in 1795 and the last one in 1863. He never became popular incidentally, but it said that he only gained an audience fit, though few. And he was also yet another person who continued to be under the influence of the classical Augustan age, and though he was writing in a romantic age, but however it was not the pseudo-classicism of the 18th century. It said that it was a more genuine kind of classicism that he was interested in. So the direct influence of this work, so a direct output of this influence could be found in works such as the Hellenics and Geber. It's said that he lived in a past world of heroic thought, unaltered by the events of common life. He passed nearly through the most eventful century of the world without learning from experience and almost without adding to his ideas. This in fact was quite unfortunate, given that when many of the other writers such as Wordsworth, Coleridge, Sade and many more others were getting influenced by French Revolution and also responding to the times through their personal and poetical expressions, we find writers such as Landor completely languishing away in a different esoteric world altogether, completely uninfluenced by the whatever is going on within their country or in the world affairs. So even during those times, it was not really considered as a commendable quality, and we do notice that the writers who did not respond to their times, either politically or in a different way, we do not find their works also living to the posterity with much reputation. Thomas Campbell was another writer who also chose not to depart much from the Augustan tradition. So in that sense, we find a continuation of the Augustan tradition and the 18th century mannerisms in works such as Pleasures of Hope, published in 1799, and Theodoric, and both were written also in the closed couplet style, which had almost gone out of fashion by the late 18th century. His Gertrude of Wyoming was almost romantic, but however he never reached his work never reached the full extent of romanticism. His works such as Lochiel, Lord Ewan's Daughter and The Last Man were considered very striking and quite influential. And however, he is most remembered today for his works such as Ye Marness of England and Hohenlinden and the Battle of Baltic, which were also vigorous war lyrics of those times. James Hogg was a Scottish writer who also earned the nickname the Ettrick Shepherd. His work, his experiences and his poetic renditions, they sprung direct from Scottish peasantry. In that sense, he is, we may also, in that sense, we can also line him up along with poets such as Burns. And he was better known for his friendship with the famous literary men of those times than for his own literary works. And two of his works which are of notable significance are Kilmeny and The Queen's Awake, in which we find him exhibiting the qualities of fancy and power, which were also linked with the ideals of Romanticism. Among all of these minor writers being discussed, Thomas More is the most attractive to the general reader in the contemporary world, and his work Lala Rookh, it was a very ambitious project that he had undertaken. It was conceived as an oriental tale, but however it did not achieve the kind of popularity that he had anticipated, and but nevertheless it continues to be of much interest even to the contemporary reader. And among his works, The Irish Melodies is the best known. And though he wrote very little and he did not achieve the kind of fame and popularity that he perhaps deserved, he is known as the last of our minstrels from the Romantic age. And Hudson says that he is also among the poets that one can classify as singers. So, having taken a look at the major poets and the minor poets of the early Romantic period, it's now important to also take a look at the canon of this Romantic period. So, as we have noted right from the beginning, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they form the first generation of the Romantic poets, and they also is included alongside. And they were also collectively known as the Lake School poets because they were all born in the Lake District in England. And until 1960, when we talk about the canon formation, only 5 male writers constituted the Romantic canon. It was Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley and Byron. These 3 writers are, we are yet to take a look at these 3 writers, Keats, Shelley and Byron. And until 1960s, the women poets of the Romantic period were not studied at all. In fact, even poets such as Mary Shelley, they began to get academic and scholarly attention only by the 1980s. In this sense, it would be quite interesting to recall that the patriarchal culture was continuing to dominate the literary scene even in the 19th century. So, whatever had happened. So, if you recall the discussion that we had in the context of the Renaissance period, how women writers were not given adequate attention, we begin to notice that the case continues to be almost the same when it comes to the formation of the literary canons. In 1995, Isabel Armstrong wrote a very powerful and influential essay titled The Gush of the Feminine, How Can We Read Women's Poetry of the Romantic Period? In that sense, it's important to take a look at the women writers of the Romantic period, which we shall be doing in one of the later sessions. So, as we begin to wrap up today's session, it's also important to highlight that in the next session, we shall be looking at the poets of the later revolutionary age of the Romantic period, primarily constituted by Keats, Shelley and Byron. So, with this, we also wind up today's session. And look forward to seeing you in the next class.